Mr. Pipes, members of the council, guests and friends, on behalf of our Board of Trustees, it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening. Let me thank the Northrop Grumman Corporation for sponsoring this evening's reception. And our anonymous member for providing this evening's wine. And all of you who will respond to our next letter about supporting cable TV for this evening's cable television broadcast. Let me remind you, our next program on the 21st will be over at the Hyatt Hotel. Is with His Excellency Ronan Sen, the Ambassador of India to the United States. This evening's program, as you know, has to do with vanquishing the Islamist enemy. I had asked one of our trustees about the topic some time ago and how important it was to really identify the nature and the extent and scope of the Islamist threat. And he suggested immediately that Daniel Pipes would be the best person to have address that topic. Our topic, of course, deals with the nature, extent of the Islamist threat and how to deal with it. Mr. Pipes has a huge reputation, as many of you know. He's a graduate of the Harvard College and has his PhD in history from Harvard University. His father was a professor there, and so he's been was immersed in Harvard for all of his early years, starting out with a strong intellectual interest in mathematics and only drifting, in a sense, into history, and then developing a real passion for the questions of the Middle East and Islamic culture. He's the author of a dozen books, I believe. They are certainly studies of Syria, of the Islamic world, and of the Middle East in general. He's also edited 2 books of essays on these subjects, including the always interesting theme of our authoritarian friends, referring to elements in the Middle East, but a dozen interesting books. He's also the co-writer of another 11 or 12 books. So he's published extensively. His works have been translated into 15 languages. He's given lectures in 25 countries. He's consulted with innumerable organizations. He's worked at the State Department, the Defense Department, most recently the United States Institute for Peace, an appointed position by the President. He's appeared on all of the major news programs and has published in the most distinguished intellectual journals in the country. He was at the Foreign Policy Research Center as its director for a number of years, 7 or 8, and founded the Middle East Forum, which is dedicated to serving United States interests in the Middle East. And as such, he's the editor of the Middle East Quarterly, a highly respected quarterly produced by that organization. Mr. Pipes wrote a half a dozen years about the threat of the Islamist group before 9/11. He's had great foresight with respect to the nature of that movement. He remains expert on it. His views are somewhat controversial at times, but always straightforward and respected. It's my great pleasure to present this evening Mr. Daniel Pipes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hurd, for that warm introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I wonder if one could be in this subject matter and not have controversial views. One would be pretty boring indeed if one's views were not controversial. Grateful that all of you have turned out. I'm grateful that the windows have been closed. Otherwise, I think it would be hard to keep your attention on my subject matter when there's such a glorious view outside. I'd say special welcome to those friends I see in the audience. I am by nature a rather happy person, but I have a topic that is not so happy, so If you excuse me, most of it will be pretty gloomy. However, it's not entirely gloomy. I think we can vanquish our enemy, but there are a lot of tough things along the way. We've been in a war for over 5 years. President Bush declared a war on terror on 9/11 itself. But mystifyingly imprecise are two key elements of that war. Who precisely is the enemy? And what precisely is our policy towards that enemy? How do we deal with it? My title summarizes my view. The enemy is Islamism, and what we must do is vanquish it, defeat it. The rest is commentary on that brief explanation of my views. So who is the enemy? There are three alternate explanations of who the enemy is. What I call the establishment view, the insurgent view, and my view. The establishment view was summarized by Secretary of State Powell one day after 9/11. He said the atrocities of the day before should not be seen as something done by Arabs or Islamics. It is something that was done by terrorists. In other words, terrorism is the problem. Nothing to do with Arabs, nothing to do with Islam. Terrorism is the issue. War on terrorism. But I'd submit to you that it's become clear after these years that that is an inaccurate euphemism. Calling this a war on terrorism would be like calling World War II a war on surprise attacks. Yeah, surprise attack started it, but doesn't mean that it was all about surprise attacks. Surprise attack was a tactic, not an enemy. Terrorism is a tactic, not an enemy. Should our enemies acquire the means by which to build up a military infrastructure and build ships and planes and tanks, they would use that. If they can use weapons of mass destruction, they'd use that. Terrorism is simply what was used 5 years ago. It's also inaccurate because there are other terrorists. Tamil Tigers of Sri Lanka, Shining Path of Peru, you name it. There are many different terrorists around the world. The second point of view is that the enemy is Islam and Muslims. And this is a point of view that really had no traction, no voice 5 years ago, and yet today is quite significant. With increasing numbers of politicians, radio talk show hosts, book authors, and others arguing that the enemy is Islam as such. Islam has always been the enemy of the West, or the Christian world. It will always be the enemy. Such elements as jihad, the inferior status of women, slavery, and so forth are permanent. They're there. Perhaps the most prominent person articulating this point of view would be, it appears, it's not entirely clear, Pope Benedict XVI. But I disagree with this because, first of all, it is ahistorical. Islam has changed. It is changing. The phenomenon we see today was not there just decades ago. When I began my study of this field in the late 1960s, there was no jihad. There were no Islamist groups. What beheadings? It was about Arab nationalism and Arab socialism and third worldism and so forth. And when I tried to explain to people, including my parents, who you heard are somewhat in the same field, that I was going to study Islam, they said, how will you make a living from that? I mean, this was not a topic that had a significant future. This is, I'd submit to you, the most radical moment ever in the history of Islam. Things have changed. They got worse, but that implies they can get better. It's a mistake to be ahistorical. It's a mistake to assume that the past is the future and the present is what always has been and always will be. Secondly, it turns friends into enemies. If you say that Islam is the enemy and Muslims are the enemy, then all Muslims become our enemy. And indeed, there are plenty of Muslims who are not our enemy. Many Muslims who have a view that is consonant with those of most Americans. And we're in a war. And many Muslims have suffered at the hands of radical Islam. Need I point out that the worst humanitarian circumstance in the world today is in Darfur, which is Muslim on Muslim violence. It is the tribesmen of Darfur who are suffering at the hands of the Islamist government of Khartoum. Hundreds of thousands have perished. Likewise, a great number perished in Algeria. Muslims, at the hands of Muslims, at the insurrection a decade ago. So it is a mistake to repulse all Muslims and say they are the enemy when many are indeed friends, and I'll argue later have a vital role in this war. Third, if one does take this point of view, that all Muslims are the enemy, where does that leave the US government? A secular, predominantly non-Muslim government? What is it to do? This is not a government that can engage in a crusade. Counter to Ann Coulter's suggestion that we kill the leaders and convert the masses. This is not a government that can do that. If Islam is the enemy, then the US government is stymied. So I will offer you a third interpretation. Not that the enemy is terrorism, not that the enemy is Islam, but that the enemy is a terroristic version of Islam, an extreme version, totalitarian version, a fundamentalist version, a radical version. Take your pick. They're all the same thing. Or Islamism. Radical Islam or Islamism is derived from Islam, the religion, the personal faith, but it is a particular reading of it. It is the transformation of Islam, the personal faith, into Islamism, the political ideology. An ideology that decides who gets what power and is an ism, like liberalism or fascism or communism. The basic thrust of this ideology is to apply the laws of Islam. To sum up radical Islam or Islamism in a single sentence, Islam is the solution. Al-Islam huwal hal. There's a drive to power, take over governments, impose one's views on others. There are two wings to this movement. The more obvious one, which uses violence, and the less obvious one, which works within the system. And we tend to focus on the obvious one, terrorism, violence of various sorts, criminality, and rightly so, it should be focused on, because it is a real threat, especially were weapons of mass destruction to fall in the hands of the terrorists. But there is another wing to this movement that is nonviolent, that is legal, lawful, political, works within the system. And I would suggest to you that that side, which is not headline grabbing and not ferocious and not scary, is indeed no less of a problem and no less of a threat than the violent form. And to use two figures to symbolize it, Osama bin Laden would symbolize the terrorist threat. How many of you know the name of Tayyip Recep Erdogan? He is the Prime Minister of Turkey, currently embroiled in a major crisis. He is not a criminal. He has no violent history. He has worked within the system. He is Prime Minister, powerful Prime Minister of a significant country, 75 million people in a strategic area, economically booming. He, by the way, oversaw much of that economic boom over the last few years. He's legitimate. He's not in any way associated with criminality or violence, and yet he's an Islamist. And I would argue that in the long term, someone like Erdogan is more dangerous than someone like bin Laden. Bin Laden is a person against whom we can bring our strengths, our military, our law enforcement, our intelligence services, our judiciary, work against the violent forms of radical Islam. But we don't know what to do about someone like Erdogan, who is legitimate, who's elected in proper style, democratic leader. And yet, there are plenty of signs to suggest that Erdogan, should he survive and prosper after this political challenge that's taking place right now, will be in a position to transform Turkey from what it has been the last 80 years, namely a secular republic, into an Islamic state that applies Islamic laws. And I would suggest that that is a danger to the Turks, to the region, and to ourselves. In sum, radical Islam, as I understand it, derives from Islam, but is a particularly vicious version of it. Misanthropic, misogynist, triumphalist, millenarian, anti-modern, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, anti-Hindu, terroristic, jihadistic, and suicidal. It is one type of Islam. It is a minority version of Islam, but it is an Islam that packs a lot of punch. I estimate it attracts some 10 to 15% of Muslims, but these are Muslims who are organized, visionary, well-funded, and devoted. They get a lot done. And likewise, fascists and communists were small in number, but got a great deal done. And likewise, those two movements had ambitions to dominate their countries, to control every aspect of life, to expand their rule, to ultimately control everything. They saw the West as their main obstacle, and the United States in particular. What stood between them and the achievement of their vision. I believe it's useful to draw an analogy between Islamism on the one hand and fascism and communism on the other. All three differ from each other, especially this one from those two, but they are similar in these basic ways. This is the third totalitarian menace that we face. And as such, we can draw upon the experience we had in the prior two. This is not the first time. The rise of Hitler was the first time. People didn't understand it. But this now is familiar territory we're in. We're dealing with a totalitarian enemy. And so I shall refer from time to time to the fascist and communist precursors. That's question one. Who is the enemy? The enemy is Islamism. Two, what do we do with it? What do we do about it? Let me quote to you from Secretary Rumsfeld back in 2001. This is the closest I've ever found to defining what victory would mean for the United States. He said, victory would be an environment in which the freedom-loving American people would fulfill and live their freedoms while their enemies would be prevented from adversely affecting their way of life. In other words, back to normal, the way things were before 9/11. I'd submit to you that that's not a military objective, simply to return to the status quo ante. It's not something you can hand to the generals and say, accomplish this. It's been vague since then, too. Just kind of understood that we're going to take care of this problem. I'd like to suggest to you two specific goals, or one specific goal and two ways of achieving it. And the goal is to modernize Islam. That may sound unlikely, and it might sound presumptuous. But if totalitarian Islam is our strategic enemy, if that's the message of 9/11 and subsequent events and prior events, then our goal must be to overhaul the Muslim world, much as we did in Germany and Russia. Germany is the better example. We did more actively achieve that there. We didn't destroy Germany. We destroyed the Nazi machine and the Nazi ideology. The fascist ideology, which was so powerful in the first half of the 1940s, faded and has ever since been a minor epiphenomenon. Marxist-Leninism, so powerful until 15 years ago or so, is now a minor epiphenomenon. How do we achieve this? How do we do something similar to what we did in 1945 and 1991? How do we take this vibrant, threatening ideology and turn it into something that is no longer a threat? Now, if you look more closely at World War II and the Cold War, you see a great variance in methods that were used. Both sought to eliminate the threat, but they did it in very different ways. 1945 was the culmination of total war, of unconditional surrender, of blood and steel, destruction, massive warfare. 1991 was something far more subtle and enigmatic. There were no shots fired. I mean, there had been over the years, but the Soviet Union collapsed without violence as a result of economic, psychological, political, diplomatic, who knows. What factors exactly went into its collapse, but collapse it did. So on the one hand, you have the defeat of the fascists in 1945, using violence primarily. And on the other hand, you have the defeat of the Marxist-Leninists in Soviet Union and beyond in 1991 without much violence at all. I think those are useful bookends to suggest the area within which we will operate in this war, how we win this. Everything from B-2 bombers to radios, from active measures to intellectual magazines. Now, there are plenty of differences between this movement and the prior two. For one, there's no great power state. Iran is not comparable to Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia. For another, there are many more adherents of Islamism than there were fascism or communism. I estimate there are 150 million supporters alive now who like the idea of imposing the Sharia, Islamic law, on themselves and on everyone else, and imposing in a very stringent way. I would estimate that's more than ever lived communists or fascists. This is non-Western, those were Western. This has a religious base, those did not. And perhaps most important of all, while in those two cases the enemy of the United States had a formidable economy and arsenal, military manpower, what does this enemy have? Box cutters? And we could, trace the developments in World War II, put little pins in the map and see who conquered which areas. One could look at the resources, oil and other resources, and see how it was doing. One could count the munitions and see who was ahead. None of those objective counters have any meaning today. We predominate entirely. There are no issues about control of land or resources. We dominate. Objectively speaking, we dominate completely, which makes it difficult to see this as a worthy enemy. How can one take seriously an enemy that does not, say, have an army or an air force or a secret service that is comparable to our own? And so many people do not take it seriously. And I think the last few years have shown an increasing divide. If we were united after 9/11, today we're very disunited. And the fundamental division, there are many in other areas of life, but in this area, the fundamental division is between those who take it seriously and those who take it less seriously. Between those who say that we're in a life and death struggle and those who say this is a minor threat. This distinction could be epitomized by the two presidential candidates in 2004. President Bush talked about 9/11 changing his life, a long war, bringing our resources to bear on it. John Kerry spoke of terrorism as analogous to prostitution and illegal gambling, something that will always be there and you just kind of live with it. And I think that is the key battle. It's not what the Islamists do, it's what we do. Do we take this seriously or do we not? Is this a threat to us, or is it just something like prostitution that we just you deal with? It's not all that important. Ultimately, then, this is a battle not on the battlefields with firepower and arms. It is a battlefield of opinion. If we take this seriously, we will win. If we don't, if we're divided, ineffectual, we might well lose. So we are the key here, not our enemy. We can vanquish our enemy should we be united and forceful. We will lose if we're disunited and without force. So the goal is, in the first place, to vanquish the enemy. But in the second place, something has to be offered in place of this ideology. It's a powerful ideology. It's an ideology that is deeply attractive to many people, tens and tens of millions. It offers a way to understand one's life and the world around one, what it means to be a Muslim. And I'd emphasize that the power of attraction of this Islamist ideology is not limited to the poor or the stressed. It has shown an ability to attract those of great means, of great ambition, of great success. I would argue that there's not much sociology to radical Islam. You can find it in men and women, you can find it in elderly and young, you can find it in poor and rich, educated and not, converts and born, majority Muslim society and minority Muslim society, you find it everywhere. Any example you throw at me, I can probably find you any definition you give me, I can probably find you an example of someone who is in the ranks of radical Islam and fits that description. So there is something compelling here, something that pulls people in. It's not just they turn to it in a time of difficulty. we who are not Muslim cannot offer an alternative. This is unlike the prior two totalitarianisms where we could, and especially in the German case, where we had a military victory, we could impose our will, set something up in our model. The only people who can offer an alternative here are fellow Muslims. Muslims who disagree with the Islamist project, who are of a different persuasion, who are moderate, who are modern, who are ready to redefine their understanding of the Quran, say in terms of jihad, or the status of women, or slavery, or the criminal punishments, the hudud, who are willing to reinterpret the role of the Sharia, of Islamic law, who want an Islam that is modern, moderate, humane, respectful of women and non-Muslims, and so forth. Now, when I say moderate Muslims have a role, many of you are probably thinking, well, what moderate Muslims? Where are they? As one commentator on my website put it recently, the moderate unicorn, the myth of the moderate Muslim. Never seen one. Well, in addition to my being able to assure you that yes, they do exist, and I know them, and I can give you names of public figures who you know, let me point out that in just the last month, 300,000 Turks were on the streets, huge rally, biggest rally ever in Ankara, to protest Erdogan's growing power. And 700,000 Turks, estimated, came out on the streets of Istanbul some days later. And just 2 days ago, on Saturday, May 5th, in 3 smaller towns, smaller numbers, but still impressive numbers of Muslims came out in Western Anatolia. Over 1 million Turks were on the streets. Those are the moderate Muslims. They're called secular Turks, but they're moderate Muslims at the same time. They were slogans like, "We don't want imams in power," "No to fundamentalist Islam," and the like. Now, the problem is that while their numbers are there is no program, there is no movement, there is no ideology. There's not a unifying force there. They're opposed to Erdogan taking more power, but they don't have an alternate program of their own. In Turkey, it's actually an interesting case, because in Turkey there is a state secular ideology that was put in place in the 1920s and 30s by Kemal Atatürk. So it's actually got an official state ideology. Problem is, and it's unique, no other Muslim state has that, it's unique that in that it's been there for decades and decades, but the problem is that there is no life to it. The Islamists are busy producing Islamist cartoons and comic books and video games and computer games and lively, interesting products. The Atatürkists repeat slogans from the 1920s and 30s. It's defunct. It's not interesting. It's not exciting. And so while the Islamists have managed to build a movement, the Turkists are much fewer in number and don't have a movement. Much less can they expound it to non-Turks, because Ataturk was very Turkish. It was a movement of Turks, so it doesn't travel. So what you have are individuals who, at some risk to themselves, it is not easy to be a moderate Muslim and stand up and say no to the Islamists. They are threatening, they're vituperative, they can be violent. It is not easy, and more than that, there is no program. There's not been a serious reassessment of the Quran and the Sharia. There's not been the formulation of a movement. The Islamist movement goes back to the late 1920s, and it took years to get to where it is now. Between the origins of the movement and the capture of the first state in Iran, it was 50 years, 80 years to get to where they are now. It didn't happen overnight. It took a lot of dedication by a lot of talented people, and generosity, devotion, to get to this position. The moderates are just beginning to put together an answer, but it's going to take time. And it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of work. And yet, I don't think there's an alternative. Or I challenge you to give me an alternative. What other alternative is there than for us to smash the Islamists as best we can, and for us to help the moderates as best we can to take their place? And that means celebrating them and their ideas, funding them, getting their ideas out, and it particularly means not helping the Islamists. We have a tendency, the US government is terrible, terrible record here, of helping the Islamists. The Islamists say basically, look, I'm not a terrorist. I condemn violence. Therefore, I'm a moderate. Let's work together. The FBI says, great idea. National Endowment of Democracy says, perfect. State Department says, bingo. And they're all off to the races with these Islamists, working with them. And the moderates looking through the window and wistfully wishing they were in there, but they're excluded because they're not as well organized. They don't have a presence such as the Islamists do. And the Islamists get to trumpet their good pal, the director of the FBI, or whoever, Undersecretary of State, who, good friends. That's a terrible, terrible, terrible mistake. We have to work with our friends, not our enemies. We have to help those who want to develop a modern, moderate, good neighborly form of Islam, not those who are quietly and successfully gnawing away at our system in order to change it through nonviolent means. Now, this approach of mine has two premises. The first is that the problem is ultimately intra-Muslim. There's a debate over what it means to be a Muslim, with the Islamists very evident and the anti-Islamists still embryonic and finding their way forward. But that is the battle. It's not between the Muslim world and us. It's not a battle, it's not a clash of civilizations. It's an argument between Muslims. And we are, in the ultimate analysis, auxiliaries of our friends, of the moderate Muslims, the anti-Islamist Muslims. And secondly, I'm assuming that radical Islam does poorly when it loses attraction when it does poorly. I give you, for example, the case of 9/11 and 11/9. 9/11 brought a huge surge of support because of the fantastic success. 11/9 was the 9th of November 2001, just a few months later, when the first Afghan city of Mazar-e Sharif fell to the coalition forces. Support plummeted. It wasn't all that great. The Islamist movement, it had its weaknesses, and support plummeted. In conclusion, how things turn out depends less on the Islamists than on ourselves. Will we awaken to see this danger? Will we take the steps we need to do? Well, this depends on us. And while we're all busy with other things, well, anyway, all of you are busy with other things, I'm busy with this, there's a lot you can do. There's a lot that one can do to help, to understand, and promote these policies that will win us the war. First, you can learn the subject matter, keep up with it. And by the way, the newspapers tend to be not very good on this. You find a whole lot more on the internet. Be in the political process, vote, give your time and money to candidates, write letters to the editor, call into talk shows, participate in internet debates, join and donate to organizations that support the kind of views that you, or that empower the kind of views that you have. You can do more in an organization on your own. You can engage in research. You can do work on your own. There's a lot to be done. Who is who? What is going on? I know of a number of cases of individuals who have, on their own, decided to become experts in this and have done very, very good work in this area. So whether we win and lose is up to us, you and me, all of us. I welcome you to join this battle. Thank you.
We thank you very much. Yes.
That means you're the best. I think I've learned more tonight from you than I have in a long time. This council is beloved to me. We have remarkable people. But tonight I had an instructor. And I had to say that before telling you my question, because I really want to know those Nazis who were humanistic, even though they were Nazis. I'm making an effort now to start a Marshall Plan for the Palestinians. I'm hoping it will be administered by a new department. When I was young, you wouldn't know, but we had not a DOD, but a DOW, a Department of War. I am trying to get the Department of Peace to administer the Marshall Plan. Would you have some consideration, or would you give some consideration to what we might do that would take the Muslims who are these Turks you speak about, who are the people that understand geopolitics but also geohumanism, and help them to progress the Muslim world and our relationship with it?
I didn't warn Mr. Pipes. I have to repeat the question for the camera. And we'll be back. No, would you comment on the viability and importance of a Marshall Plan for the Palestinians and perhaps project that concept farther?
Thank you. Thank you for the kind words. Let me not take it up with the Palestinians, because that's a rather special case. But more broadly, let's say Turkey and beyond. Is there a place for a Marshall Plan? Well, Marshall Plan came into existence, of course, after the war, not during it. We did not fund Germans during the war. We funded them after we defeated them. Perhaps the better analogy would be, say, in the late 1940s, in the Cold War now, when the Soviets were backing their friends, subordinates in Europe, and our friends were being swamped. It looked in, say, 1947, 1948, the communist parties in countries like Italy and France would rule. Italy and France would become part of the Soviet bloc. What we did then would seem to me analogous to what we must do now, which is to help our friends. And the way it was predominantly done back then was by the US government turning into, in small ways, a foundation and making grants with few strings attached to intellectuals, political leaders, labor organizers, and others to promote a democratic way, an anti-Soviet way. And this worked very well. And Europe did not succumb to the Soviet rule. In other words, just as the Islamists are now using democracy and using it very effectively, because they are the alternative to the military rulers who dominate so much of the Muslim world, so the Soviets were using democracy in Western Europe. And we countered it with our funds and our imagination to make it, to empower our allies to stand up. And I would say that's what we should do today. We should use our resources to help our friends to stand up to the Islamists who get hundreds of millions or perhaps billions a year from the Saudis. Time for us to chip in and take part in these activities. I mean, the Saudis have publications and have television stations, fund mosques, provide education, provide imams for mosques, you name it. There's an all-inclusive program that's been built up over the decades. It really goes back to the early 60s. Time for us to wake up. 45 years later, admittedly, but time for us to wake up and do something similar. Now, there are obvious difficulties. The US government cannot sponsor imams, can't have religious education or build mosques, but all that said, there's a lot we can do. So I would rather see it in light of the Cold War than World War II.
Mr. Smore?
Yes, a follow-up to the question, the previous question. You didn't mention the 60-year Arab-Israeli conflict at all in your presentation, and I find that interesting that you're talking on terrorism. There have probably been more terrorist events during that 60 years in Israel than all the rest of the world combined. The largest terrorist groups are Hezbollah, Hamas, they're oriented that way. Just last summer, there was a new war between, with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. At the recent Arab summit meeting, the main topic to remove what everyone knows has been a historic reason for animosity and frustration and aggression within the Arab world.
How important would the resolution of the Arab-Israeli controversy be?
I didn't mention it because, contrary to what you say, it is way down on the list of conflicts that have led to large number of casualties. I mentioned Darfur and Algeria advisedly because those are at the top of the list, and I could give you many others. Iraq alone in the last few years has had many more casualties than the entire 6 decades of Arab-Israeli conflict, or at least the Islamist, and particularly the Islamist side of it, where the casualties probably number in the hundreds or maybe 1,000. No, that's it's a major political issue, but the reason I haven't mentioned it and indeed avoided it in the first question is because it is such a major political issue in itself, with so many vectors of its own that we can just switch over and talk to that instead. But since we're talking about this, let's stick to the Islamist topic. To address your point, would resolution, yes, it would be helpful, no question. It would be helpful in many ways. There are numbers of individuals who are agitated by developments there, just as they are by developments in Iraq, and want to do something and go off and do something. There's no doubt that it would be helpful. But would it be profoundly helpful? Would it solve the problem? No way. Let me offer you a scenario. Imagine, as you sketched it out, that the United States comes up with some kind of initiative. The Arabs and the Israelis say, great idea. Everybody packs away their munitions, and a Palestinian state emerges, and it's in a harmonious relationship with Israel. All goes well. Issue closed. Okay? And it's not too likely anytime soon, but let's just imagine it. I would suggest to you that that would have, indeed, a positive impact, but a minor impact on the general question that I've raised. Because I don't think that Muslims in Nigeria, Malaysia, Kazakhstan, Morocco, and so forth, are primarily motivated by the Arab conflict, the Palestinian conflict with Israel. I didn't mention the Kashmir topic either. It's a very problematic issue in South Asia. And if it were solved, it would help things. It agitates Muslims far and wide. Were it solved, it would be positive. Would it take care of the threat of radical Islam? No. Nor would the Iraqi problem, nor would any other. In other words, there's something far more fundamental. I've knocked away 2 explanations, one on my own and now the second with you. The first was that this is a result of poverty or some other form of stress. The second is that it has to do with some specific issue, like the Arab-Israeli conflict, Iraq, Kashmir, American troops in the Middle East, or whatever specific you wish to choose. Let me offer to you what I think is the real reason. The real reason for the rise of Islamism has to do with a profound sense of unhappiness over the state of the Muslim world. Not one's own individual circumstances, but the state of the ummah, of the Muslim world. That things have gone wrong. The simplest way to portray that is to contrast today with 1,000 years ago. In 1007, Muslims were on top. Politically, militarily, economically, technologically, culturally, the world of Islam was flying high. And that, put a very complex set of ideas simply, that led to the notion that to be a Muslim was to be favored by God, not only spiritually, but also in a mundane way. If you're a Muslim, you're on a winning team. And that sense of being on a winning team was there from the very beginning. Muhammad fled Mecca in 622 and returned to Mecca in 630 as its indisputed Lord and master without firing a shot. The Islamic armies had great success within a century of his death, conquering areas from Spain to India. There was a sense that you're on a winning team. Fast forward to the present, or the last 2 centuries. Since 1800, to be a Muslim has been been to be on a losing team, has been to be economically, militarily, politically, culturally, technologically behind. Whatever graphs you look at, whatever statistics you pull up, literacy, longevity, wealth, you name it, Muslims inhabit the bottom, with the exception of the oil-rich states. That is the problem. How do you solve that? What went wrong? How do you solve it? And over the last 2 centuries, there have been 3 basic answers. The first was from about 1800 to 1920, you emulate the French and the British, the liberal Westerners. And the second was from about 1920 to 1980, you emulate the Nazis and the Soviets. You emulate the illiberal Westerners. And the third has been since about 1975, you develop your own indigenous illiberal way of doing business. This too will pass because it's not going to work, and something else will be returned to, and let's hope it's something that works and something that helps the Muslim world modernize and come to terms with its present condition, and puts aside this turn towards illiberalism or authoritarianism or totalitarianism, as has been the case for nearly a century now.
Admiral?
I think you presented a very excellent case. I do have a few questions. First, I am Mr. Page. I have traveled and worked, I have lived there, but I have done very extensively in Iran, in Egypt 12 times, Jordan, all those countries, not Iraq, have been in Syria. You did not mention Indonesia, where I believe the largest number of Islamic people live. Not sure why, but I think that is significant. I have found many Islamic Muslims, not radical, I agree with you on that 100%, but you sort of lump the two somewhat together. Sometimes you separate, but not too much. But I think that Islam itself is a religion that should be respected. Just as a correction of a recent thing, the country of Libya have more post-baccalaureate degrees in the Libyan population per capita than any country in the world. And the U.S. will agree with you on that. Yeah, they have oil, sure, but just to say they aren't all dumb. But I am concerned. What about our situation with what I call an extreme radical Christianity in our country, which I think may be affecting some of our actions.
The question, I believe, is does immoderation within the American society influence our behavior toward the Muslim world?
Let me start by agreeing that certainly not all Muslims are dumb. I hope I did not convey that impression. Let me also agree that the Indonesian population is the largest Muslim population, and by and large has been moderate, though there are radicalizing elements today. And that does offer a source of hope. For example, Abdurrahman Wahid, the former president, is an important moderate Muslim voice. Let me also agree that Libya has a great number of PhD holders. All true. I don't think I said otherwise. On the question of Christianity in this country, radical forms of Christianity, I am reluctant to see any parallel. I believe, as you heard, that this form of Islam should be compared with fascism and communism. I do not think it should be compared with, let's say, fundamentalist forms of Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, or other religions. None of those aspire to this totalitarian control. None of them aspire to world domination. None of them have a record, anything remotely like the Islamists do. They have not taken over countries. They have not engaged in jihad or whatever the alternative is, the equivalent is. I don't think there's a parallel. Now there are places like Nigeria where you see a jihad versus a crusade. It's vicious. Churches get burned and then mosques get burned. There's a tit-for-tat quality, and it could explode. But I still don't think. I mean, I see the Christians of Nigeria in a fundamentally defensive posture, and the Muslims and the Islamists. There's a book called The Talibanization of Nigeria. The Islamists, the very extreme Islamists in Nigeria, on the offense, wanting to control and dominate the country. So I'm reluctant to see a parallel there. Let me just add by way of footnote, since you did mention Libya, that in 2 weeks I take off to go see Muammar Gaddafi. A personal invitation to go chat with him. Should be interesting. I write a weekly column, and I plan to write up. If you'd like to get the column, there's a sign-up sheet out there, and you can get it gratis and read about my experiences with Muammar Gaddafi.
Well, that should indeed be unique, I think. But yes, ma'am, you were waiting patiently.
I have felt for a long time that the change in the Ummah has to come from within, that there's only so much we can do. But there are voices like Bridget Gabriel and Nuna Darwish and Jesse Ali and others who don't seem to create a following. And also, I find that they don't receive enough support from the rest of us, including Europe. We tend to kowtow, if anything. We tend to appease. Look at the Danish cartoon episode. We tend to appease radical Islam rather than encourage change.
The observation is that many moderates who are challenging the harsher forms of Islam don't receive a lot of attention and support. But in contrary to that, we seem to appease radical Islam. Would you comment on that?
Well, I completely agree, and I made the point about the FBI director being palsy with the Islamists. Yes, it's a big problem. However, you name 3 women who don't fit it. Bridget Gabriel was born a Christian. Noni Darwish converted to Christianity, and Ali Hirsi Ali has left Islam. I don't know that she's anything else, but she's not a Muslim anymore. So these 3 are not people who are in a position to formulate a moderate Islam. It is not enough to be an Arab. One has to be, speaking Arabic is not the key. One has to be a Muslim, and none of these 3 are. And indeed, a number of disaffected or modern Muslims say enough. One is finding this as a real phenomenon in Iran. The Iranian government, an Islamist government, is saying the Islam that you get from us, that is Islam. There's no other version. And there's a significant number of Iranians who are saying, well, if that's Islam, we want no part of it. And they are not Muslims. They're apostates. Which is a very, very dramatic step to take. I mean, they don't announce it publicly, but they are not in their hearts any more Muslims. Because in Islam, you're not allowed to be an apostate. You're not allowed to leave the religion on pain of death. So there are interesting developments in Iran. But if there is to be a moderate Islam formulated, it has to be by believers who are engaging with the texts and arguing what you keep and what you leave. Let me give you an analogy. You mentioned the Episcopalian Church. There's a controversy racking the Episcopalian Church now for years over homosexuality. And it fundamentally boils down to, obviously, the Bible. I mean, if you read it, it's clear that the Bible condemns it. Now, is that something you want to reinterpret or not? Do you want to read it in a new way and interpret it and say, well, that was then and now we permit it? Or do you not? Raging battle threatens to split the church. That's the kind of battle that even so advanced a church, if one might call it, as the Episcopalian is engaged in. It is what Muslims have not done. They have not been, to an adequate extent, say, a raging battle over slavery. Is slavery something admissible in Islam, or is it not? You will find it broadly assumed by Muslims that it's not, but it's actually not been argued out. Is jihad valid as a war to extend the boundaries of territories ruled by Muslims, or is it not? Hasn't been argued out. Do women have equal rights with men or not? It has been argued out. Do non-Muslims have equal rights with Muslims? Is it valid to convert out of Islam? All these major issues have not yet, in effect, been touched. And that's where the real hard work lies ahead. And that's where there's only been the very modest, very, very modest beginnings. And it's going to take a while.
But what about the appeasement in the West?
Appeasement in the West is there. I don't argue with it, yes. That's what I'm working against.
Sir. You're next. Please, yes.
Mr. Pipes, you've had a
campus-wide, of course, is an activity of the Institute.
Campus Watch.
I'm sorry. And the assertion is that you keep a list of people who are non-supportive of Israel, and that this list of professors, by its existence, is intimidation. Would you comment on the value of that and whether it fits within the American system?
Well, you, first of all, mangled what Campus Watch is. I wish you'd brought with you a printout of the page and read it rather than extemporaneously characterize it. You got it all wrong, every single bit. You've got it? Well, I don't know about quotes. Do you have the page? If you look at, Campus Watch is a project I started 5 years ago in an attempt to improve the terrible state of Middle East studies in this country. It's not about Israel. It's not about being pro-Arab or anti-Israel. It's about doing a good job in analyzing the Middle East. And there are many, many aspects of the Middle East, of which, of course, the Arab-Israeli conflict is one. You make it sound like it's the secret police coming and taking people away at night. We are an outfit with a total of 2 employees. We see ourselves as comparable to, say, Consumer Reports. You want to buy a toaster? You check out Consumer Reports. Or political analysts who tell you whether they think somebody's doing a good job as a politician. Or theater critics who say this is a great play or a miserable one. Great movie or a terrible one. That's what we're in the business of doing, of assessing whether Middle East specialists are doing a good job or a bad job. And unfortunately, most of the time, it's a bad job. And we see it as a useful function to make the general public aware, parents of students, alumni, board members, trustees, that they got a problem in Middle East studies. And you know what? Once they find out about it, they go, we got a problem in Middle East studies. Case A would be Columbia University, which the depths of problems in Columbia University Middle East studies beggar the imagination. And this has been a crisis now for several years for Columbia because they have this incredibly radicalized and poor department of Middle East, or members, instructors and researchers dealing with the Middle East. We do not, I'm delighted to inform you, we do not have police powers. We have yet to lock anybody up. All we do is criticize. They have their freedom of speech, we have our freedom of speech. They talk about us. By the way, I've had some nasty things said about me. And we talk about them. We say, look, here's their research. Here's what they've done. And maybe you think this is good research. We don't think it's so great. I can't see what's objectionable. So your question was, is that an American thing to do? Yes, sir. It's a very American thing to do, to argue.
Yes, sir.
I am a Muslim, and I must say that I like most, if not all, of what you said. But I'm not clear as what you mean by a good Muslim, or the word a moderate Muslim. Is it that what you mean by that is a person who does not adhere to Islam, in fact, but he's a Muslim by name? Is it similar to the only good Indian is a dead Indian? And therefore, the only good Muslim is a spiritually dead Muslim. Now, if that is not the case, if you say that, no, I want them to practice their religion, I want them to believe in that religion, as long as they don't espouse coercive spread of their religion. Now, if that is the case, then why all this attack against the government in Turkey when you admit that they do not espouse coercion?
There's a juxtaposition between the question, is a good Muslim a non-spiritual Muslim on one hand, or is the good Muslim you describe a non-aggressive terroristic Muslim? And if so, what is wrong with the leader of Turkey today who falls in that second category?
Thank you. Good question. I have no problems with Muslims being pious Muslims. I, as I hope you've noticed, do not talk about the substance of religion. And whether a Muslim is pious or not is not my concern. What is my concern are his politics. And I believe that's the concern of the country. To put it in American terms, I have no problems with Muslims being immigrants or converts, born into the faith, and fitting their faith into the structure that exists here. I believe in equal privileges for Muslims, but not special privileges. I believe that Islam should fit into the United States. And the Islamists, as I understand them, wish to change this country and remove the current structure, constitutional order, and replace it with the Sharia. To that I say no. I will fight that. I'll give you one small example, which I departed. In Minneapolis Airport, the Muslim taxi driver said, "We will not convey passengers who have alcohol." And they were about to get the airport to have two different lights on top of the taxis, those who will convey alcohol and those who will not. I put my 2 cents in and said, this is outrageous. The U.S. government must not, in the form of the Minneapolis airport, must not be in a position of applying the Sharia. This is Sharia compliant, this is not Sharia compliant. This is not the way we do business here. It's not, I mean, on a private level, sure, but on a governmental level, no. But if the taxi drivers are willing to fit in, find an occupation that suits them, then all's fine with me. When it comes to Turkey, what we have is a situation, and it's a very interesting situation, because what we have is in Erdogan and his colleagues are a group of individuals who come out of a frankly Islamist background. The first time an Islamist leader took power in Turkey was Necmettin Erbakan in 1996-97. He was frankly and openly Islamist. His first trip was to Iran, and he put together a group of, and so forth. He was openly, he'd been a long-time career politician, and he was in favor of this Islamic program. He was thrown out by the military, which is the ultimate power broker in Turkey. His lieutenants, some of them, got wise and said, we're not going to do this again. We're not going to make these same mistakes. And they formed a party that was much softer, the AK party, the one that's in power now, with Erdogan at its head. And they say that they are good citizens of the secular republic. And they have no desire to change things. And so there is the possibility that they've had a change of heart, and they accept the existing order and are not trying to change it. Possible. And there are some signs that would suggest that's the case. I could provide them to you. But there are other signs, and there are more of them, which suggest that they have not really had a change of heart. They just had a change of tactics. They saw what happened to Erbakan in '97. They don't want the same thing to happen to them. They don't want to get shoved out by the military. And so they take it more carefully. So they will propose, for example, the criminalization of adultery. They will give special benefits to graduates of the religious schools. They will close down or work against media that is not in the Islamist camp, and so forth and so on. And all of this leads me to worry that they haven't really had a change of heart, that they're just, because the army is there and watching closely, that they haven't had a change of heart, but have had a change of tactics, are approaching it more softly. And as you can see, I'm not the only one. The Turks who are living there in the millions, the military, the president of the country, the leader of the opposition, have all come out in the last few days and said roughly the same thing. This they perceive as a problem. Now, maybe we're all wrong, and maybe Erdogan and Abdullah Gül and the others, Bülent Arınç, all of them have had a real change of heart and are willing to work within the system, and they're being unfairly judged by others and myself. But they've given us too much evidence, and we're inclined to follow our instincts here, and it is instinct, there's no proof. You could make a good argument, I've heard them, that Erdogan has had a change of heart and he's not pushing and he's working within the system. My instinct tells me no. I worry. But it is a valid debate. There are certain things one cannot debate. There are certain people like Erbakan who just obvious. But Erdogan, the current prime minister, is subtle, and there's room for debate. I'm actually leaving for Turkey in 2 days, and we'll spend the whole next week focused on this question and hope to be writing on that as well and come up with. All I can tell you is that 2 years ago I went to Turkey, and before I went, I had no question in my mind that Erdogan was an Islamist. Spending a week in Turkey and hearing everything, I realized it wasn't an open and shut case. But the subsequent 2 years have made me more inclined again to go in that direction. Who knows what this next trip will show? But it is open to argument. I acknowledge that.
Yes, sir, in the rear.
Mr. Pikes, I think you have artfully presented the Islamic threat. I guess I'm wondering how the current Shiite-Sunni conflict and then Al-Qaeda fit into that equation.
Would you specifically comment about the Sunni-Shia rivalry, as we see it in Iraq especially, and the Al-Qaeda variable?
The Sunni-Shia divide is an ancient one, going back to the first decades of Islam, and has been there throughout. When you look at the Islamists, whether Sunni or Shia, there are two different approaches. One is to say, in particular the Sunnis say of the Shia, these are non-Muslims, these are not acceptable people. And in other words, the general Sunni dislike and fear and worry about Shia is increased. To almost write them out, or in some cases write them out of the religion. And opposite way, the Shia look at the Sunni as arrogant, violent, and hostile, and so forth. But there's a second variable, there's a second way of looking at it, which is that we've had our historic differences, but now, whether Sunni or Shia, we basically agree on an Islamist program. And it's not so important whether we speak Arabic or Persian, whether we are Sunni or Shia, whether we're this or that. And these two different approaches are in contention with each other. It's not clear which one will win. In Iraq, it's clearly the former. In Lebanon, they're getting along quite well now. I'm not sure. Al-Qaeda is of the anti-Shiite disposition, but Al-Qaeda is just one group of many, and I'm not sure it's the most important.
Yes, sir.
My question is to you. There is no question that Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan received support from the Saudi Arabia and manpower, or from ISI, intelligence from Pakistan. And as a result, we went to Afghanistan to fight them. But my question to you is, there is Al-Qaeda right now in Iraq. And we know no doubt about that they're receiving support from Syria, probably Iran, and Saudi Arabia. However, we are not doing anything for 3 years maybe already. In fact, we're just going the other direction now. We're trying to appease them. So my question to you, how we can really actually defeat it, ever terror, if we don't ready for some kind of apocalyptic event to do on them? To bring this to the insanity.
I think the question is whether physically, can we physically really defeat the...
Let me. We are not fighting Al-Qaeda in Iraq. How can we defeat Al-Qaeda if we're not fighting it in Iraq? Fair enough?
We are fighting terror. We're telling how we want to construct this, how we want to express this to people. It really doesn't matter, because it is an organized effort by some extremist Islamists to undermine our principles. How we can really bring this to conclusion if we're not willing to really send them a message that we are willing to defend principle of democracy once and for all, because just by talking, we are not getting anywhere. We are staying in Iraq. We will stay another 5 years even. We will not get anything done regardless, because the terror will continue.
I agree with the question. We cannot defeat the Islamists without defeating Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That is a key battlefield today, and it is one where we no longer have the heart to continue. We no longer are committed to it in the way we were initially. I think what that points to is we have to pick our battlefields very carefully. the Iraqi battlefield was perhaps not the right one for us to enter in on. And we didn't do it the right way, and we're not doing it the right way. It is, in any war, you look very carefully where you should fight and where you shouldn't. You pick your battles, and getting rid of Saddam Hussein was one thing, but staying in Iraq and engaging in this low-level tactical war with the insurgents, so-called, I think doesn't play to our strengths. We're not. Our strengths are not. Our strength is not walking the streets of Baghdad and securing neighborhoods. Our strength is much more strategic. That should have been a task left to the Iraqis, not for ourselves.
I have to apologize to the gentleman there who's been waiting and numerous others who have had their hands up for a long time. But we do end our sessions at 10 minutes after 7. I apologize for that. We'd all like to stay here, most of us anyway, for a long time. We must thank our guests for an absolutely marvelous evening. Thanks so much.